I had people walk up to me at festivals and say, "Oh, you're the first Black person I've ever touched or spoken to." Strange, but it wasn't frightening. It was annoying a little bit, but it wasn't frightening. Or, "Oh, you're different and there's nothing else." I remember saying to one of my Japanese friends, "Is this normal? Old women on the street just coming up and touching my child and then just walking away, not even talking to me." And they were like, "That is not normal."
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, subscribing is the best way to support us. It helps us grow and bring you new stories from life in Japan. All right, let's jump in. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we welcome Avril in the studio. Thank you so much for coming.
It's lovely to be here.
You're a university professor at Aichi Prefectural University.
I am.
Also
an associate professor. Yeah.
A women's empowerment coach here in Japan. You lead a group for Black women here in Japan, a community group, a support group, where you do much more than just this, because I don't know so much about it, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I'm curious about your journey first. Mm-hmm. You've been living here, I think, for over 20 years.
Yeah, over 25 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's go back to that first year. What brought you here in the first place?
Well, I think, like a lot of foreign people who come to Japan for 1 year and end up staying, I really just wanted to travel and experience something else. I had spent 4 years doing a public administration degree in England, the north of England, which I actually really loved. But the third year, we had working experience in the public sector, and I worked in public sector. I worked in hospital management, which had been the area that I wanted to work in. And it was actually the worst year of my life. Really? It was awful. It was horrible. Wow. It was just awful.
What made it so bad?
Well, I was in the very far north of England, in Gateshead. So outside of Newcastle, which is quite a big city, and Gateshead in the 1990s. It wasn't a very diverse area. And I found the accent really difficult to understand. Sorry, anyone who's a Geordie. And I worked in this office environment. I was bullied. I did make some really good friends. But it wasn't a very safe environment for a young Black girl. I was followed, I was punched. It was just not a good year. And also just working in an office and I know not all offices are like that, but at that age, I was just like, okay, I just do not want to go back into an office environment right now.
Well, when you have such a traumatic experience and all these associations, I imagine that the memory kind of just stays there.
It just stayed. So some friends of mine were applying for the JET program. I'm sure many of your viewers have done that or know of it. And they were like, "Why don't you apply and just travel for a year?" I was like, okay. And then that's basically how I came to Japan.
Did you have any prior interests? Or
I didn't even know where Japan was. I know, it's so embarrassing to say, but it was kind of pre everyone having the internet in their home days. Yeah. And I didn't know where it was. I had to go to the library and get a map and look it up.
I'm quite curious then. How was it for you? You apply for this program. You don't know too much of the country you're going to. You hop on a plane and you arrive here.
It was terrifying.
Because we have a lot of guests that, they develop an interest through anime or manga or pop culture or traditional culture. And those tend to either have also they maybe have preconceptions about what it's going to be like, or they're seeking something specific here.
Right.
But I'm curious how it's for someone like you that doesn't know anything and you just arrive here, Tokyo, I imagine.
First Tokyo, and then I went to live in Nagano.
Okay, so up in the mountains.
In the mountains, yeah. Yeah, so no, it was really, and my family, of course, were just like, "Why are you going to Japan? What are you going to do about your hair?" That was the main thing. And then, so I had all this fear around it. And I didn't really know what to expect. I knew it was very different to China because all of my family thought it was the same country. And I was like, no, we know it's a different country. And so coming here, and then I was with all of these people who did know a lot about Japan. And some people spoke Japanese and they had been studying about Japan. And I remember thinking, yeah, I probably should have done that before I came, prepared myself a little bit. But I was terrified. And then I went to the countryside and there was just nothing there except for beautiful mountains and rice fields. But honestly, from the very first day when I walked into my school, I was working at a junior high school. People were so kind to me. So kind. 3 students fainted.
They fainted?
They fainted. I think it was because of the heat. I'm not really sure. I had to be introduced to the whole school. There was a whole ceremony and that was lovely. And I had my 2 phrases of Japanese and I went up and bowed. And as I stood up, all the kids were standing up and 3 of them just fainted.
When was that?
That was, now I'm telling you my age now.
Early 2000s, late 90s?
No, it was 90s. It was the mid-90s.
You mentioned earlier that when you were working or studying in the outskirts of Newcastle, you were one of the few Black women working there, and that was difficult for you.
Yeah.
But I imagine that in the late 90s, as a Black woman in Nagano, there were probably also not many people that you could really relate to experience-wise. And for the students and such, that was also...
But I think what is interesting, though, at least in those days... when I was in Newcastle, for example, there are a lot of preconceptions around, people of colour in the UK, and there's a lot of fear and a lot of animosity and violence. But that wasn't the case in Japan. There was a little bit of fear, but it was mostly curiosity. It was more, oh, you're different. And, I've never met somebody like you. I had people walk up to me at festivals and say, oh, you're the first Black person I've ever touched or spoken to. And, that was strange, but it wasn't frightening. It was annoying a little bit, but it wasn't frightening. And I could understand this is just, curiosity and there's nothing else underneath that.
I imagine from this curiosity probably also came a lot of perhaps strange questions from students. When you're at this high school and then the students come up to you or in classroom are staring at you and just wondering something. What are some of the experiences that you kind of had there?
Well, I think, students, when you're ALT, students always try to get away with asking you inappropriate questions or asking you questions about your personal life or your age. But I had really supportive JTs, Japanese teachers of English. And so none of the students really got out of line. But I do remember once being in a restaurant, a family restaurant with some kids, and a little toddler crawled over, maybe, 3, maybe 2, and she licked my leg. And then she said, you don't taste of chocolate. And my mum was mortified. She was really disappointed. I was like, no, I don't taste of chocolate. Sorry, I'm quite sweet. But I didn't really in those early days, I existed in this bubble of acceptance. I was just the ALT from England. And that was what was important to them. It was a very small village. It was a town, but really a village. And they just embraced me.
Must be refreshing coming from a place where there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of judgment cast on you, and to go to a place where everyone is just kind of open and curious and accepting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And it wasn't, at least for the first 2 years, until I sort of felt that there was any difference between me and other ALTs, or until I moved to Nagoya. Things changed a little bit. But yeah, those first couple of years in Nagano, it was really good. It's really good.
You said you kind of came on the JET program maybe for a year or so to try something new, travel. What made you stay? What was the thing that during that experience made you decide to extend your time here in Japan?
Yeah, I just really liked it. I really enjoyed what I was doing. I loved my school. I was only at one school. I was making friends with people from all over the world, but also with people in my community. And a lot of those people are still my friends today, right? Many, many years later. But I just really enjoyed my life. And I think, to be honest, in those first 2 years, I felt like I started to understand my British identity a little bit more. I had never really identified as a British person because you're just in England, you don't really need to, right? But I realized that when I was in Japan, I wasn't automatically seen as a British person or an English person, and I actually got quite offended by that. I mean, because people thought I was American or from an African nation, which is fine. But I realized, actually, my British identity, well, my English identity is actually quite important to me. And there were lots of realizations in those 2 years. And then, of course, realizing how I was perceived by people from different countries, like by the Americans or the Canadians or the Australians, or it was very interesting, very interesting. But anyway, to go back to your first question, I just really liked being in Japan at that time. Yeah, so I decided to stay.
You decided to stay. You had a background, you mentioned studying something about hospital administration. You come and you start teaching high school students.
Yes.
At some point, this idea of a break kind of transitions into, okay, what is going to be my career? And you somehow pivoted into academia.
Yeah, that was kind of an accident too. But I really felt like I found my thing, right? When I finished on the JET program, I decided I'm still not finished with Japan, and I've spent all this time living in the countryside, which is lovely, but I'd like to go to a city. So I moved to Nagoya, and I worked in Eikaiwa, which was interesting. And I still just felt like every year that passed, I just kept feeling like I wasn't finished with Japan. And I would go home to England and I would visit, and it was always lovely. And I would consider, moving back. And I really did think I was going to move back, one day. And then time just sort of passed. I moved into sort of HR in Eikaiwa, and I was training teachers. So I thought, this might be something I want to do when I go back to England, go into HR. And then I met my husband. That kind of derailed things.
Usually does, yeah.
A little bit, yeah. I was like, well, excuse me. He could come to England or I could stay here. And so for many years, we had this back and forth, are we going to leave or are we going to stay? The economy was not that great in England. We didn't really want to go anywhere else. And so I thought, I really enjoyed the sociology part of my degree. Yeah, that's my area. I love looking at social administration, sociology, and social justice topics. I'm going to do a master's, and it's going to be connected to Japan and connected to Japanese society, social issues in Japan. And then I'll be able to work in university. And I hadn't actually thought that would be permanent either. I just thought, for now, this is the thing I'm excited about doing. Yeah, that's the next goal. So that's how that happened. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. So you kind of had that experience working at Eikaiwa, which you described as interesting with kind of a few implied things there, and maybe we'll get back to it. But eventually you realize that experience teaching and kind of how the training is done and the implications of teaching and I imagine teacher-student relationship, foreign teacher-student relationship was something that was worthy of being studied and explored a little further. So you apply for the master in Nagoya?
Actually, it was through Sheffield University, but it was distance with like 2 intensive summer programs, 2 years.
So what exactly did you end up researching during that?
I looked at a lot about gender and diversity in Japan, and I really loved it. I loved learning about the different ethnicities in Japan and the history around that and gender issues in Japan, because I was sort of experiencing some of them myself in many ways, being a woman in Japan. And I just really, really loved that. And of course, I studied the language, of course, too. But I really enjoyed that, the gender, anything about race or ethnicity or about the history of different groups in Japan, like, the Korean ethnic minority or the Chinese ethnic minority or Ryukyu, all of those things I just really enjoyed.
From a, let's say, Western perspective, I feel like this kind of field of study is now quite common. A lot of people in that field of study has even translated into conversations through the media and in private and such, gender identity and such.
Yeah.
Was it the case in Japan at the time? Was there a lot of research done on these different perspectives? I feel like publicly in the media, there is often this debate about, is Japan ethnically diverse country or is it not? And then there will be arguments in one direction, arguments in the other direction. But how much studying is actually done about this here?
Well, actually, more than you would think. I was quite surprised, especially when it comes to looking at this idea of homogeneity, which is a word I always find difficult to say. But, you know, it's a myth, right? It's a myth. And there's been so many people that have written about Japan's diversity, about the different groups and about the history and about why this has become a myth, because it's connected to this idea of, you know, Japaneseness, this idea of Nihonjinron, and, you know, us and them. And the idea of harmony is that we are all the same. Okay? But actually, Japan has always been a very diverse country. It's always had its different languages and dialects and ethnicities, and it still does now. And it's actually getting to the point now where more people are talking about it, more people are publishing about it. Young people are wanting to talk about this and wanting to explore their own different kinds of diversity. And I think that's really exciting to see. It's taken a while.
What is kind of the trigger for this change? Where I imagine in the West, maybe just an assumption, but the more individualistic nature of our societies means that everyone is kind of looking for the one thing that makes them special and kind of trying to maybe tie identity to this. But in Japan, if you grow up and everyone tells you just, you're Japanese, we're all Japanese, we are all the same, maybe you question that less. But if this is changing now, there must have been some kind of a trigger or social shift, I imagine, that leads the younger generation to question that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this shift towards wanting to be more diverse, but not necessarily wanting to be different. I mean, I can only sort of talk about my students and how I've interacted with them. But when I talk about diversity in my class, especially cultural diversity or ethnic diversity, you know, 10 years ago, some students would secretly come up to me after class and say, you know, my mother is Korean, or, you know, my father is from Indonesia. But now they are the ones that are starting this conversation. They're looking for this avenue where they can express themselves and talk about all aspects of their identity. And then I think the other students, the students that maybe don't have that kind of diversity in their families, but they still are wanting to know about this because there's this interest, right? More greater interest, I think, in the world outside. And they're seeing that there are more different types of people coming to Japan. And it's not just to do with ethnicity or cultural identity. It's to do with gender. It's to do with sexuality. It's to do with disability. And it's just being able to acknowledge all of these different factors in society. There's definitely a greater interest. What is the trigger?
Maybe there's none. Maybe it's just a gradual shift.
Maybe it's, a gradual shift. Yeah. I'd find it very hard to answer that question.
But you dove into that research topic also just thinking like, okay, for now, this is what I'm going to do. For 2 years, you research this, but you didn't stop at 2 years. You kind of went all the way to do a PhD and become a professor here in Japan. So what exactly did you find so interesting about the academic journey here that made you in the end stick with that kind of path, which you're still on today?
When I finished my master's, I had wanted to do a PhD, but, you know, I had one young child at that time, then I had another, and so then I was just sort of mothering, and but it was always there in the back of my head. You know, I'd like to explore more, because the topic of my thesis for my master's was actually what Japanese people thought about Black people in Japan. It was Japanese perceptions of Black people. But then I thought, well, I really would like to know from the other side. I want to talk about our experiences and our narratives and make this part of like the academic discourse, because it wasn't there. There was really great research on connections between different ethnicities. Like John Russell had done some fantastic research on, the Black other in Japan and the history and post-war history, and just really great research. But there wasn't a lot that was looking at our experiences. Mm-hmm. But I think that when you want to research about race as a woman, gender always has to come into it, because we are treated so very differently based on our gender. And so that's kind of why I decided to focus on women. So I'm not answering your questions very succinctly, sorry.
But I'm very curious about where this is going, and specifically about what you ended up kind of taking away from your research.
So, well, the reason why I thought, okay, it's possible for me to do a PhD is because I'm also part of this group of women who have Japanese partners. And one of the women in that group, she was the same age as me, and when she did her PhD, because I was kind of thinking maybe it's too late. But she was like, no, I can do this. And I'm a university. I could be your supervisor. So she kind of really helped me.
Wow.
Her name is Diane Nagatome. She's a wonderful writer and researcher and human being. And she really, really pushed me. So being part of that community was just amazing. And I don't think I would have done it had I not had that kind of support. What I found from my research when I looked at Black women and their stories in Japan is that there is a lot of similarity, but a lot of difference. Mm-hmm. And that difference is largely based on where you come from. So even within within the Black community, there is hierarchy, right? Oh. And I was kind of aware of this, but anecdotally. But what I found was that the women themselves felt that, well, I don't have, as an American, I'm kind of at the top because you have the passport, or as a British person, mm-hmm. you have the passport. But if I'm from any other country, especially an African nation, I'm kind of at the bottom. And it wasn't necessarily that these women were unable to get jobs because of their passports or their idea of being non-native or treated as non-native teachers. It was just that it was harder. And I saw this. And also, I found that people had different ideas of what being Black in Japan meant. Again, based on where they came from. So, for example, a lot of my American participants were like, being in Japan is just like, I'm free of racism, no one's trying to kill me. It's wonderful. Okay. But then I had a Jamaican participant that was like, oh my goodness, Japan is so racist. And that, of course, is because, like many people who are part of the racial majority in their country, they'd never faced racism before because they were always part of the majority. So they had that kind of majority and privilege thinking. So that was very interesting. I think that was one of the biggest things that I found. And I also found that accent was such a marker, perceived to be such a marker of whether one is a good English teacher or a bad English teacher.
Oh, interesting.
So I would have a Jamaican participant who said that she heard teachers in her school, she was an ALT, and she heard teachers in her school talking about how, we're going to get an American ALT, and this will be great because now the students can hear real English. They'll be able to speak real English. And she had been teaching there for 2 years and thought she had been doing a really good job. But because she had this slightly Jamaican accent, which is actually closer to British pronunciation than anything else, mm-hmm. She was deemed as being sort of a less valuable or less authentic teacher.
So there's no such a thing as like, everyone in the end has their own experience. And the interesting thing is based on where they're from and kind of their background and perception. But you also mentioned that your thesis for your master was mm-hmm. the other side, basically, the perception of black people by Japanese
Yes.
in Japan.
Yes.
What was the finding there?
Well, that was, yeah. Sometimes when I was going through that research, I was like, I wish I'd never asked this question sometimes, because I've basically found that there was a very big difference between how Black men and Black women were perceived. And so Black men were ascribed adjectives like, violent or scary or big. And so were Black women, but less often. But they tended to get things like kind and maternal and, sweet. So there was this huge fear around the Black male presence that actually wasn't there around the Black female presence. And that's partly actually because, well, I don't know why, but I remember asking that question and people who were answering my questionnaire saying, it's really hard to think about perceptions of Black women because we don't really know any, don't see any in the media at that time anyway, on TV so much, unless they're in like music videos, a couple of sportswomen, but they just really did not have a perception. And that goes both ways as well. It wasn't necessarily negative and it wasn't necessarily positive.
When you kind of study the both sides of the coin, so to say, and kind of look at how people are being, or community, diaspora is perceived from one side, and then how the diaspora perceives themselves, did you notice that maybe the narratives were kind of like parallel to each other, and there was perhaps like a lack of ways of those communities to really integrate and really kind of share and explain, and it was just them and us from either side, so to say?
It was definitely, it was very different, put it that way. But there was more knowledge, I think, at least for the Black female side. They knew that when they walk into a classroom, excuse me, that cold again. So when they walk into a classroom, students already have lots of perceptions about them. It's called, researcher calls it sort of like cultural baggage, right? When students go into a classroom. And so for a new teacher, or one of the first things they want to do is to sort of contradict this idea of what a Black person should be.
Breaks the stereotypes.
Yeah, that's based on the stereotypes, right? So there was sort of knowledge on that side that, okay, they're thinking that I'm a good dancer, or they might think I'm a little bit scary, or, they might think I'm good at sports. So I'm going to do something to stop that stereotype. On the Japanese side, it's unfair for me to say there was little understanding because my sample was quite small. And also I looked at people from all walks of life, and perhaps had I interviewed people who were more familiar with Black people or from any country, the answers might have been different. But I noticed that there was a lack of understanding, and part of that lack of understanding is a lack of research.
So that was your research from an academic perspective.
Right.
You graduated, you got your PhD, and you ended up starting to teach. So that lack of understanding, in a way, now you're bridging that gap through your classes and having conversations with students. I'm curious about this now, when you're at university and bringing up these topics of gender, of identity to your students. What are the kind of conversations that you're having? What are the interests of the student in those?
Having such great conversations. So I've been talking about this with my students, for many years, and I've sort of learned how to do it. And it was actually kind of good in a way because I was working while I was doing my PhD, so I could kind of try things out, which was good.
The guinea pigs.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, a lot of students will say to me, I've never had the opportunity to talk about some of these issues before, whether it's to do with their own identity. So we look at ideas of what does it mean to be Japanese, for example, and I'll show them videos and pose certain questions like, who has the right to call themselves Japanese, and why do you think, you know, the meaning of being Japanese is kind of wide, getting wider, or is it quite narrow? You know, I'm very much not in the business of telling students what to think, but I'm just giving them, I hope, an opportunity to think in a different way. And I sometimes might share personal stories, not very often, because really, you know, we want to keep that boundary. But I think as a teacher, sometimes you sort of learn, okay, well, maybe my students could benefit from this personal story because it fits with this topic. And so students tend to really delve into these topics. And sometimes it can be quite contentious.
Also,
Well, for example, gender, you know, and some students are coming from a position of never having thought about these topics before. So you might get people saying, well, you know, the girls have this women-only carriage on the train. That's not fair, is it? You know, and I'm like, well, maybe it's not fair, but is it about fairness, or is it about safety? You know, what's the reason for this train? Where did it come from? Why is it needed at all? What could we do instead? And that will help them to start thinking maybe around this, rather than being in just this very sort of straight line. I think the most contentious topic I've ever done in one of my very high-level classes, and this was the class with high-level Japanese students and high-level international students, was about privilege. And many of these international students are from different ethnicities as well. And it was so interesting because you could see that students are really thinking deeply about this idea of, why do I have privilege and why does this person not? And in what situation? Or why do I have to worry about my privilege? You know, it's not my fault I'm born this way. And so being able to navigate that, you know, there was one point in that class where I was like, okay, this is getting really very, very serious. But when we come back together and we summarize it, getting students to acknowledge that other people will have different perspectives that they're not going to always agree with, you know, but yet they can still remain friends. They can still come to some sort of understanding, and they're leaving with different knowledge, because a different perspective is different knowledge, right? So I don't know. What was your question again? Students just sort of delve into the topic.
Specifically, kind of what I was curious to hear about, what the students are curious about and where those conversations are going, especially for these topics that I feel, and maybe it's a misconception, but they are perhaps less visible and less discussed here in Japan. And from some of the podcast guests that we've had, that maybe bring up some of those topics, and reading through the comments, we see, oh, don't bring Western ideology to Japan, or don't teach Western ideologies in Japan. But then are those really like Western concepts, or are they just topics that are being discussed more openly in the West versus less here? And so I'm kind of curious, like, about like the students kind of discovering something that may be new to them.
Well, I always focus on Japan. Okay, so students might find it very odd to be talking about cultural diversity in Japan. But, you know, after a couple of weeks, they're the ones that are coming to me and saying, well, can I do my presentation on the Vietnamese community? You know, it's really growing. Or can I do my presentation on, you know, the Muslim community, because I realized that there was a mosque in the middle of Nagoya. And it's sort of opening their eyes to what's in front of them. You know, there's no point, I think, anyway, talking about racism in the UK, because we're not living in the UK. Okay, they can only affect change in Japan unless they go to live in the UK. They can do that. So I'm always encouraging them to look at these topics from a Japanese perspective. So things like talking about race or gender or identity or ethnicity, these are not Western ideas, because they're happening right now in Japan and they need solutions. And there is a lot of like grassroots stuff happening in Japan, and students are the ones that are going to sort of carry it forward and continue that work. So I'm happy if it begins in my class.
You mentioned there's no point in talking about racism in the UK. So I'm quite curious about racism in Japan. Does it take a different form than what
Yes, it does.
happens in the UK or perhaps France, Germany, America? Perhaps maybe more subtle or
it's definitely different. But I should probably just clarify. I'm not saying there's no point talking about racism in the UK.
Of course.
Do not quote me on that, people.
For the context of the class.
For the context of the class. But I might use an example from the UK to then bring it back to Japan. Of course, I'm always interested in stuff that's happening in my country. Yes, it's different. It is. It's very different. One of my research participants, she said that sometimes she felt that it was more xenophobia than out-and-out racism. And definitely there is a lot of xenophobia. There's a lot of fear of people from different countries. But the reason we know racism exists is because, again, depending on where you come from and the color of your skin, you will get treated differently in different places. It does tend to be a little bit more subtle. It may be more to do with going to a restaurant with a white person and having the waitress come over and talk only to that person, even though you're the one talking, which is usually what happens when you're with a Japanese person, right? Or it may be that you sit down on a train seat and somebody actually stands up and walks away, or just the way they look at you, or they judge you, or you may be at work and you may have different rules within your workplace. You may feel that you're under hyper scrutiny and that your boss is a little bit more strict with you than with your colleagues who happen to be American or white or male or whatever. And so it's really, in some ways, it's a little bit worse because it's harder to identify. Whereas, if I'm going to be around racists, I love those good old racists who will just tell me, I don't like you because you're a black person. I know exactly where I stand. But when it's very subtle, it's very hard to understand, or it's hard to identify. It's hard to do something about it, to call people out on it.
Because you don't know if it's about you as a person or about the color of your skin or
exactly,
how you dress.
Exactly. Or is it you as a woman? It's probably a combination of all of those. Again, it's this intersectionality.
You've been kind of studying, researching this and living here, you mentioned 25 years. And at the time you did your master's thesis, you were saying that for a lot of the people you interviewed, they didn't really see many black people here in Japan. They didn't really have many experiences to refer to. If you were to kind of conduct that research today, do you feel like things would have changed, the perception, the interactions of black people here in Japan?
I think so. I mean, especially because of this, of social media as well. Everything is so much more accessible. I think definitely that would be different, and I want to say more positive, I think, because there have been more positive images coming through, like Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, it's just been different. And also, there are more black people in Japan now. So just with my group, the Black Women in Japan group, when we started, the first couple of months, we had like 60 people, and now we've got like over 5,000 people in that group. And many more women are coming from the Caribbean. So we used to have just mainly Americans. That was the largest group. And then the British were negligible somewhere down here. But now we have a lot more sort of Jamaicans and Antiguans coming and going into the schools. So I think there's a little bit more access now. I have students at my university who are like, oh yeah, my ALT was black. She was from Jamaica, and, so there's more diversity and more ALTs coming from other Asian countries too, like, Malaysia or Indonesia. So I think if the research was done in a city like Osaka or Nagoya, I think it would be different. And I like to think it would be more positive because I am an optimist. Yeah.
We talked a lot about the academic side of your research on the topic. I'm curious about your personal experiences with this, because you mentioned earlier you met your partner, husband, the father of your children. So children that are born here, mixed race in Japan.
Yeah.
And I imagine that aside from your university and how you kind of interviewed people and their experiences, you've probably gone through quite a few of them yourself. And I'm kind of, I would like to hear, how was it for you when you even got married to your husband back in Japan?
Yeah.
Were there any misconceptions or conversations, or on the contrary, maybe a very open family-in-law that didn't?
Yeah,
really...
I mean, no, his family have always been really open and accepting. I think my race has never been an issue. I think they were just so relieved he got married. But they were worried that I would take him out of Japan. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing. And for my kids, I mean, yeah, there have been some issues with the kids in terms of the way people react to them, more now than when they were young, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and also helping them get a sense of their Black identity, their British identity, as well as their Japanese identity, and helping them understand that all of these things are important. I do feel, this is a slightly different topic, but one of the mistakes, it's a big word, but I think, yeah, one of the mistakes that some people make when they have mixed heritage children is not putting emphasis on all parts of their identity. Yeah, obviously, if we're in Japan, possibly the Japanese side is going to be a little bit stronger, but it's very important for me, for my kids to know that they are Black and to know what that means. And that means something different to being British, and to also have these conversations at home where they can talk about it. Do you know how when my kids were young, of course they're gorgeous. People wanted to just touch them all the time. And when I was a young mother, I remember saying to one of my Japanese friends, "Dude, is this normal? Like, I've got these old women on the street just coming up and touching my child and then just walking away, not even talking to me." And they were like, "That is not normal."
I'm having that same experience now too.
Right. Okay.
So it seemed like mixed babies are sort of magnet for old ladies wanting to just
to
play with the
touch them.
cheeks. Yeah.
Yes, and then just just walk off. It's like a drive-by baby. And that is it. No one said anything to you. But I found it obviously really distressing. I don't want my child growing up thinking that it's normal to be touched by strangers, especially my daughter. My friend was like, "No, that is not normal." So I started to say, "Please don't touch, please don't touch her, please don't touch him." And so my kids from a very young age, they would be like, "So what? So I don't know, could I say?" Especially my son used to have this big afro, and they would actually start to say, "Please don't touch me." And sometimes people would be like, "Why?" And I'd be like, "Why do you think it's acceptable as a stranger, to come up and touch a child? That's so intimidating." And then they realize, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's just, they were so cute. And I lost myself." And I know there's no malice in it usually, but it's not good for my child to have that much attention.
You mentioned that it was important for you that they get a sense of their Black identity, their British identity, and that you wanted to have conversations about this at home. I'm curious if there's been a moment where maybe, the kids are at school and they just play with the kids. And kids are usually innocent and curious and say things without thinking about it too much. And maybe another classmate said something, and then one of your children came home and it was like, "Mom, someone said this to me today. What does it mean?"
Not so much that. Not so much to do with their color, but just to do with their, gaijin-ness, whatever that is. I remember my daughter came home crying one day when she was like And she was first grade, so she was 6 or 7. And she was like, they just keep calling me a gaijin, And I tried to talk to the teacher about it, but he didn't understand why that was inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And he he made the child come and apologize without any explanation. That she's not a gaijin, she's Japanese, or, she just looks different, and, you're half of your mum and half of your dad, and so is she. And so this boy was just so confused by that, and I always wish I had stepped in and talked to him. But that was probably the only time. And it also helped the fact that her brother, who's 3 years older than her, talked to the child as well and said, don't call my sister a gaijin. But it hasn't been so much at school. I mean, we live in a small town just outside of Nagoya. So we're just kind of part of that community. But I do remember one day my son came home. He plays football, soccer. Okay, the US people. We football.
Can leave it at football.
Okay, he plays football. He's really good, actually. And he had been on a trip with his team somewhere. They'd been to an away game. I think this was when he was like second grade of junior high school. And he came home and he said, what happened today? We had driven somewhere from Shizuoka and we stopped at this conveni, and this small child came in. I don't know, maybe she was like 8 or 9. And she looked at me and she was like, "Kawaii," and, scary, and ran to her parent. And he was just upset because it's horrible to think that someone thinks you're scary. But I was really glad that he had said that to me. But what was sad for me was that I said, it's probably not the only time that's going to happen, unfortunately. It's not the only time, and some people do see Black people as scary, but most people, not everyone, but it's going to happen. But when it happens next time, you just remember it's not really about you. It's just because she doesn't know. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't feel bad about it. Of course you can have those feelings, and you can talk to me about that. But it's probably going to happen again. But you are amazing.
As a parent, I imagine that can be also quite scary, because the children are not in the moment able to process everything that's going on, understanding the context, and you might worry if they're going to start having, anxiety issues with this, or not wanting to go to the away game anymore because they are afraid of this. Yeah. Did you ever think about it in a way that you need to do something about it? Or was it more, they just need to go out there, it's going to happen, they're going to have to deal with this, and then we can have a conversation at home?
Well, we have lots of conversations because those things happen to me all the time, those sorts of things. And so I will tell them about it. I will model, the way I hope that they will deal with it. So it's not just sort of one conversation, but we have those conversations all this time. We talk about other people. And also, 2020 was a fantastic opportunity with the whole, Black Lives Matter protest. That was a great opportunity to bring up a lot of those topics. And my kids were teenagers by that time. Well, one of them was a teenager by that time. And I was involved with planning the Black Lives Matter peaceful protest in Nagoya. Mm-hmm. And so they were part of that. But at first they didn't realize why they should be a part of it, even though I'm their mother. And I was like, this is not something that just happens in America. It happens all over the world. And there are minorities in Japan who are suffering too. It's not just about, about this one incident. It's about all this kind of injustice. And you are Black. So yes, you're Japanese, but when everyone sees you, they're going to see you as Black. And I would hate for you to have something like this happen to you and not know how to deal with it or not know how to get support. And I think that really kind of opened up lots of conversations. And they'll just come home and they'll just tell me things or tell me their thoughts about their identity. Or someone, in class today, we talked about being bilingual and what that means. Or, some people think that my hair is weird and they wanted to touch it. It's just creating the space. I've had friends, I still have these friends, and people have said, my child came home and they were like, oh, these people were staring at me and I felt really uncomfortable and, they were talking about me. And they were like, oh, that's because you're so cute, because you're Hafu and, because you're so cute. And they were just really jealous. But to me, that doesn't really help the child process being othered. And it's just to acknowledge, okay, they see you as different because they don't know you. It is going to happen. And if it makes you feel uncomfortable, like if you're on a train and people are staring at you, and it makes you feel uncomfortable, move to another carriage, okay? If you can wait until you get home, then we can talk about it. But it is horrible when it happens. It's hard, and it doesn't matter what their intention is because it still makes you feel horrible, right? So it's just being real, I feel, just being real about it and just letting them know that you and home are the safe space to talk about those things, because the danger is they don't talk about them and it just builds up, right? And it's like a volcano and, they end up crying or breaking down or punching someone. It's just creating that space.
When I asked you about if you've had some of these experiences and these difficulties when they were younger, you said more so now than when they were younger. So is it more challenging now that they are teenagers or students? And are they facing more of these difficult situations than when they were children?
Yeah, sadly. So, there's the whole gaijin seat thing on the train that happens a lot. Not so much to my daughter, but my son, who is tall and gorgeous. And also he's living away from home now and he's at university applying for jobs, part-time jobs. Some of those jobs he's not getting. And we know that it's because of his appearance, so for example, him and his friend had to send in a picture and, the friend got called in and he didn't. So those sorts of things. When he used to live in Osaka area and he used to play for the junior section of one of the teams. And people on the street used to call him names, and I had to talk to the coach about this to say, I know there's nothing you can do about it, but I want you to realize this is happening and it's going to be an extra amount of stress that the other boys do not have. So you just need to be aware of that. So yeah, there's those things that as a parent makes you want to kind of like do something about it, but.
What is the difference between them being now young adults versus children in the way that they are facing more discrimination or racism that maybe they didn't have so much? Is it because the innocence of the child is gone in a way and people it's like the child is cute, but the adult is scary?
Yeah, maybe that. But I think it's also environment, right? It might be different if they were still at home, like if he was still at home all the time and they were just at home going to the local schools. That's a community that's known them since they were like 3 or 4, right? So the environment is different, but they're especially my son is out of home and outside of my control. So he's going to find himself in situations where he has to protect himself now. He has to sort of know what to do. And of course, talk to me about it too. But yeah.
You talked a lot about the conversations you have with your children. What about conversations you have with the institutions? You brought up talking to the coach. You had that incident with the teacher, but the teacher didn't explain to the child that bullied your daughter what the problem actually was. So when you were in all these situations and growing up, how were the institutions throughout this in dealing with children that are Hafu and Black too?
Well, I think one thing to understand about our children who are going to Japanese schools is that they will stand out, even when they're not trying to stand out, right? It's not just their appearance. And this used to happen to me when I was a child in England. So my son, I remember when he was a first year, he got scolded and manhandled actually by one of the teachers. All the students had to leave the class, and his friend was still in the class. Something was wrong with the friend. He went in to say to the friend, "Look, let's go." And then he was the one that got in trouble. And it was exaggerated. It was unnecessary. And so I realized, okay, I need to talk to this teacher, but not in a, don't touch my child kind of way, which is what I was thinking, right? But I had to make him understand, I said, for some reason, you targeted on my child because he stands out. And, he's told me that if everyone's talking in the class, you'll call him and say, be quiet. And I'm like, I want you to think about why this is happening. What is different about our family than other families? What different about him than others? If he deserves to be scolded, please go ahead, scold him. But I want you to tell me the times when you feel that he has deserved to be scolded. And he was actually like, I can't really think of any. And he didn't realize he was doing it. It was just to create that awareness. And I think I went in there and I was calm. I didn't do it in Japanese because I was like, I just don't want to make mistakes. So I asked one of the English teachers to help me. And I just explained my viewpoint and why I think it's happening and maybe that I was wrong, and gave him the opportunity. And it was very interesting because at the end he was like, I just didn't realize I was doing this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Then he started calling me and asking me for more advice. But anyway, that's another story.
But that's interesting because I was going to maybe follow up by asking if there needs to be some kind of institutional change, or rather just open conversations with teachers that are also facing these situations for the first time and having these biases, unconscious biases, unaware that they are singling out students for looking different and such. And through conversations, some of them might open up.
Absolutely.
And change their mind. And little by little, this is just making the education system more accepting.
Definitely. I mean, I really think there needs to be sort of institutional change, but I think as a parent, we have to be very proactive. And it can be difficult because, it's obviously there's emotions involved and,
it's your child.
It's your child. So it's hard to be rational, but we have to be proactive. Not be afraid of going to talk to a teacher, even in a different language. We can get help. Not being afraid to talk to the principal of the school, and hopefully that will bring change. But I think if we say nothing changes.
So one of the places that you are having a strong voice and saying a lot of things is your empowerment group.
Oh,
you mentioned that earlier a little bit, that you started out with just about 60 foreigners, mostly from the United States, and now you've got over 5,000 people throughout Japan.
Well, that's slightly different. So that's the Black Women in Japan group.
Black Women in
5,000, yeah. But my empowerment group is something different because, I had a spare 10 minutes. It wasn't like that.
So both groups where you were very involved, very different, but approaching, discussing, bringing up equally important topics.
Well, important, but the empowerment group is quite different in that it's more about coaching and it's more about trauma release. It's more about limiting beliefs. I'm not an expert on trauma, but a lot of the beliefs that we hold come from things that happened in our past, right? And this impacts your relationships. It impacts the money that you receive, impacts how you feel about yourself, how you talk to yourself even. People generally are quite unkind when they talk to themselves, right? And so we look at all of these issues in different life areas. The reason why it's a women's group is because, I feel that women do need this safe space to express themselves. A lot of women, we're not taught to express our emotions, especially if it's anger. So we need this safe space. I do coach male clients too, but when it comes to the group, when we're together, it is just a woman's group. And so this whole personal development thing, I think this is actually one of the reasons why I'm still in Japan. Although if I was in England, I think it would still be a good thing, because I think that as people, we are constantly growing and changing, and life can be a lot. Sometimes it's a lot to deal with. And I think we have to allow ourselves these spaces to connect with ourselves, these spaces to grow, and not to blame and not to shame ourselves. And this is what I do within this group. I learned how to do it. I became certified, and I want to share that with other people. In fact, I have a workshop coming up.
And probably many more. I don't know when it's coming up, but the episode might be released more before or after.
Oh, right, right. Might be after.
We will make sure to have the link in the description so people can kind of stay up to date. But you said something interesting that it will probably be equally interesting in the UK. But I'm assuming in the UK this might be more common than in Japan.
It is more common. Yeah, it is more common.
Do you also have Japanese women joining these workshops?
I do. I actually have people in Australia and a couple in the UK, but mainly Japan-based foreigners or Japanese. So,
are the challenges different? The kind of the way this kind of personal development is being approached, is it different depending on your background?
Actually, it's not. And that's what's so interesting. A lot of people have low self-esteem. For example, a lot of people don't know how to draw boundaries. A lot of people overgive. A lot of people are perfectionists in the sense that, not that you like everything in a certain place, but that you're such a perfectionist that you can't do something, you're frozen, you procrastinate, or then you just end up not doing and not trying because you think it's going to fail. And it's interesting, actually, the main deep core wounds, the issues, are actually all very similar, no matter where we come from. We all have the same stuff.
Interesting. So that's the women empowerment group.
That's the women's empowerment
and the
group.
other one is the Black Women in Japan, which
Black
is
Women
now
in Japan group.
Big community here.
It is.
Can you tell me a little bit about that initiative?
So basically, we wanted a community, right? I've been living in Japan for a few years, and I was just like, I know there are more Black women out there. Where are they? And so a friend and I just started this Facebook group, and it started off with just the two of us, and then a couple of months it was 60, and then suddenly it just kind of expanded. And then we decided, well, we've got all these women, let's kind of get together. And so we started to have conventions in 2017. We had one in Nagoya, we had one the first one was Tokyo, then Nagoya, and then in Kansai and Kobe. But then COVID happened, and we just haven't had one for a while, but we're going to have one this year. So it's an opportunity for a lot of Black women to come together and support each other. What's really interesting to me about the Facebook group, because my kids and my students tell me that young people do not do Facebook. And I was like, okay, fine. But actually, most of our members are in their 20s and 30s, and they're still joining this group. And people come to that group, for support, for friendship. They want to learn about living in Japan. They want to learn about jobs, or they might be having an issue at work. And they want to know, what should I do about this? Is this because of my gender? Is it because of my race? Or they want some business ideas, or they might actually have a business and want to know how to grow that business. So there's a lot of networking as well as sort of support and friendship in the group.
So all the questions you had when you arrived in the late 90s
and had no one to ask,
had no one to ask to,
yeah.
You're providing a space where people can put together their centuries of combined experience to kind of help each other out.
Absolutely. And it's not just me. It's a whole group of women who are sort of running the group. We have a committee of women who are coming together to create the next convention, which will happen in Nagoya in June. So it's really a cooperative effort. There's some really amazing women. And that's actually how I met my friend Kina, who came here with me through this group.
25 years is quite a long time, especially when you plan to just come for a little trip and experience to kind of get away from studies that were not really your cup of tea. How do you look back on those 25 years and kind of this path you've taken and been on and the things you've decided to dedicate yourself to?
I just find it surprising. I would never have I just would never have seen myself in Japan, doing what I'm doing, married with children. But looking back, when we look back on life, we can often say, can't we, like, I wish I'd done this, I wish I had done that. And of course I do that too sometimes, but I know that everything that I've done has brought me to this point, the good and the bad. But I think living in Japan has been really good for me. I just don't know if I would have had the opportunities that I've had I stayed in the UK. And not that those opportunities are not there, but I don't think I would have had the mindset. It just opened my mind to the idea that I could do different things and I could be different. I did not have to be this sort of tough woman on my guard all the time. And I often felt like that in the UK.
The path you've chosen through academia kind of exposed you to also face a lot of the challenges that we discussed throughout this conversation of Black people in Japan, from the perception of the Japanese, from the self-perception of the Black community, from the questioning of the students, from raising your own children here. Has that given you at any moment or put you in a place where you were thinking like, oh, this is maybe too difficult, maybe we should move to a place that's, I don't know, more accepting, if I can phrase it like that? Or did that actually not come up? And quite the contrary, studying all of this made you realize, well, of course there are bad things, but not too bad.
Oh, it comes up every couple of years. It comes up all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think when you live outside of your home country, you always think, should I go back? And maybe it's just too much here. There are things in Japan that I feel like I can't get, like community. It's hard to be away from your family, but yeah, every couple of years it's sort of come up like, should we go back or should I have gone back? Not now, it used to in the past, but I go home to England and I love it. My family's there, friends are there. But I'm always relieved when I come back to Japan.
It's your home now.
It's one of my homes. Yeah, definitely. Homes. Yeah.
If some of our listeners are people that kind of have faced or are facing some of these situations and maybe considering going to your next convention or reaching out and such, what will be some of the key things you'd like them to take away from this if they are Black in Japan or Black and considering moving to Japan and are worried about some of the points we just talked about? What is a mindset to have to approach this, to turn this into a positive story like yourself, where you found one of your homes?
Well, I think you have to be open to understanding or trying to understand Japanese systems. We're not here to impose our culture and will. We do have to understand where people are coming from. And that will helps you to sort of integrate more when you have a little bit of knowledge. I would tell, a young Black woman who's coming to Japan, make sure you bring lots of hair products. Very difficult to get. But also to realize that it's perfectly fine to be yourself. You don't have to try to be Japanese or try to be some perfect English teacher, or whatever you're going to do. It's perfectly fine to be yourself. And also I would tell people, and this is people from all, ethnicities, male, female, whatever, is that find community. And if there isn't community where you are, create it, because we all need community and that's how we thrive, not just survive, right? It's how we thrive. So find your community. If it's not there, make a group and people will come to you. It's so important.
We covered so many topics today. Is there one topic that was maybe dear to you that we didn't touch upon, that I didn't ask you about, that you would have still liked to maybe bring into the conversation?
I would actually like to talk a little bit about native speakerism.
Yeah.
Because I think...
What is a native speakerism?
Well, native speakerism is another ism, which is the idea that for teachers of English, the best kind of teacher is someone from an inner circle country. So that's the UK, the US, Canada, Australia. So basically, by being born in that kind of country, you are going to be this amazing teacher, right? Because, you know, we don't have to like study or pay for it or anything like that. But that is basically native speakerism. So what we find, not just in Japan, but in the industry all over the world, that if you do not have a passport from one of those countries, then you tend to be treated more harshly. You may not actually get the job. Many jobs still ask for native speakers. And even if they say near native, that's sometimes, you know, really they just mean a native speaker. So I think it's really compounded when it comes with race and with gender. So if you're a woman from a country where English is not the primary language, maybe you're from an Asian country, then you have more hurdles to jump over when you're trying to get into this industry. What I want people to realize is when it comes to universities anyway, now I work with a lot of really lovely people, but when it comes to native teachers, most universities their native teachers are male and their native teachers are white and generally from America, the UK, Australia. There are a lot of good people in those positions, but I'd like them to realize they have so much power because often they are the ones on interview committees. You know, they are the ones who have the last say, or at least the first say as to who comes in. And having diversity within with a university team is so important for students to see these different perspectives and different people. I am the only foreign woman in my department and the only woman of color. Students, especially the ones that feel a little bit, you know, different for whatever reason, flock to me. And I would like to share that load. We need to have different perspectives because students are begging for these different perspectives. They want to be challenged. You know, they want to have different ways of thinking. So yes, for those teachers who are in those positions, recognize your privilege, get this diversity into your team because it will just benefit you and it will benefit the students.
I think that's a great message to kind of end this conversation. I hope that if people hear this, they will think about this and maybe little by little, one conversation at a time, there will be some positive change. Avril,
I hope so. Wow, we've talked about a lot.
Yeah, we did. It was super interesting to hear your story, in your journey into academia, your challenges raising your children here. And it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for making time and coming to see us in Osaka.
Oh, I had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for sticking with us all the way till the end. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the podcast. It helps us improve the show and bring you more in-depth conversations from Japan. Take care and see you next time.